Just test it. Okay. Well, do you want me to switch it back to public when you're ready? Okay.
Rashad, I'm looking at a trash basket that I can see on my screen. Can you see that behind me?
Right? Yeah, I can see it.
So I need to.
No, I think we
On
should
the
be.
right side, can you see this, can you see anything on the floor on the left of me?
No.
Is it clean now?
Yes.
Okay. Rashad, I'm going to change the privacy to public, or do you not want
Eric,
me?
ask Stephanie if typed. Well, in like 2 minutes, I want to start. Hi, Shiana.
What did you want me to ask her, Ariva?
Is Tyciana in the green room? We need to ask Stephanie to get Tyciana in the green room.
My whole screen just froze and then it kicked me off. I don't know if that happened to anyone else.
Is Tyciana in the green room? Well, I'm asking Stephanie to make sure she gets there.
Oh yeah, I just spoke to all the guests. They all should be getting on soon. You want her in there right now?
Yes.
So go ahead and post. Let's get started because it's 8:45 according to my camera. Yeah, let's play the intro and let's go. Don't say anything, you just have to text me.
Rashad, tell me when and I'll press go live on all three.
One, two, three, four, five. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
Ariva, mine is public. SNN is unlisted, so I will.
Good morning and welcome to the special report, your one-stop place for COVID-19 news you can use, expert analysis, and compelling stories. This is part 2 of our special series, Race, Policing, and the Pandemic. Yesterday marked the 8th day of protest across the United States and around the globe over the death of George Floyd, an unarmed Black man at the hands of Minneapolis police. One former officer was charged with third-degree murder and manslaughter. The other 3 officers involved have not been arrested or charged at this point. Now, the charging of the one officer, nor the aggressive and absurd threats by Donald Trump to send military troops into states to quash protesters have deterred the hundreds of thousands of protesters who have taken to the streets in all 50 states and more than 10 other countries. Protesters have made it clear they are sick and tired of being sick and tired. They want change and they want it now. And this change goes well beyond arresting the 3 other officers who brazenly kneeled on Mr. Floyd's back and neck for an excruciating 8 minutes and 43 seconds. Protesters and activists around the country want to end the injustices in the criminal justice system, a system that devalues the lives of Black and brown men and women. They want to end a system that results in police killing Black people at a rate that's over twice as high as that for whites. And they want to end a system where police killings are the 6th leading cause of death of young Black men. In part 1 of our special, we talked to national experts about what went wrong with George Floyd's arrest and the trauma his family and the nation experiences witnessing the death of Black men by police. Today, we're asking how we move forward. How do we respond to the demands of change and eliminate the systemic racism that permeates police departments across the country? My guests include a Michigan sheriff whose picture of him kneeling with protesters went viral, a protester who says their pleas for justice are being ignored, Arthur Paul Cavell, who says white people are not doing their part to end racism. And joining me are 2 of the nation's leading experts on police reform and members of President Obama's 21st Century Policing Task Force, Sean Michael Smoot, and returning this morning is Dr. Cedric Alexander. We have a big show planned for you today, so it's time to share the page, invite a friend, and start a viewing party. Post your questions and comments. I want to hear from you. Now for the latest COVID-19 news. As of today, more than 6.2 million people across the globe have been diagnosed with COVID-19, and the disease has now killed more than 375,000 people worldwide, according to the latest data compiled by Johns Hopkins University. In the United States, more than 1.8 million people have been infected with the coronavirus, and more than 105,000 people have lost their lives. On Monday, U.S. Surgeon General Jerome Adams warned that a substantial number of new infections are to be expected as a result of the massive nationwide protests taking place over the murder of George Floyd. The coronavirus has disproportionately killed African Americans, who are more vulnerable to the disease due to underlying health conditions such as hypertension and diabetes. Now, on Monday, American pharmaceutical company Eli Lilly announced that it has started the first human trial of an antibody therapy designed to treat the coronavirus. Patients are currently being treated with the therapy at hospitals in New York, Los Angeles, and Atlanta. Now, we're going to continue to watch developments with respect to these studies as they may provide the breakthrough needed to fight the coronavirus. Meanwhile, 3 million people have recovered from the virus. And in other news, on Monday, George Floyd's family released an independent autopsy report which concluded that Mr. Floyd was murdered and that his death occurred as a result of sustained pressure on his neck and back, which cut off the blood flow to his brain. Now, this independent report contradicts the original report of the local district attorney and the county medical examiner. That report said that Floyd died as a result of a heart condition. It referenced chemicals that possibly were in his system, and it did eventually say that the restraint by the police officers had something to do with his death. But stark differences in these 2 medical examiners' reports. We learned recently that the Minneapolis State Department of Human Rights have filed civil rights charges against the Minneapolis Police Department and has launched an investigation into the pattern and practices of that department. Now, this department has a history of discriminatory practices against Blacks. African Americans account for only 20% of the city's population, but they are more likely to be pulled over, arrested, and have force used against them than white residents of Minneapolis. The police department used force against Black people at a rate at least 7 times that of white people during the last 5 years. And according to recent reports, Black people accounted for more than 60% of the victims in Minneapolis police shootings from 2009 through 2019. As protests erupted in all 50 states, cities issued curfews to address individuals who looted and destroyed property, detracting from the mostly peaceful protests. Protesters in New York, Atlanta, Washington, D.C., and other cities were met with unprecedented levels of violence from police. In D.C., police used pepper spray, tear gas, and rubber bullets to remove protesters from Lafayette Park. Get this, so that Donald Trump could walk to the historic St. John's Episcopal Church, not to pray, not to talk about the police brutality, not to talk about what changes need to happen in policing around this country and how do we address systemic racism. He walked to that park not to do any of that, but to pose for a photo holding up a Bible. These antics were met with strong condemnation from religious leaders across the country. That takes a minute for us, I think, just to sink in, to see our president standing before this historic church holding up a Bible. Vice President Joe Biden called him out and said it would be good if he would open that Bible and read it rather than stand there for a photo op. Now in Brooklyn, we saw 2 police cruisers lurch into a crowd of protesters, knocking several to the ground. In Atlanta, police officers used aggressive levels of force against protesters, including pulling 2 students from a car, crashing their window, and dragging them from their car. Now, President Donald Trump didn't say anything about the police violence being used against peaceful protesters, and he said little to soothe the pain caused by the heartless killing of Mr. Floyd, or the tactics that we're seeing across the country being used by police towards African Americans. Instead, in a conference call on Monday with the nation's governors, he told them that they were weak for letting the demonstrations get out of hand. And in an address to the nation, he threatened to even invoke the Insurrection Act, an act that would allow him, according to his thinking, to send military troops into states if governors didn't, according to him, get control of the streets. This president threatened to send U.S. military troops into states and for those troops to take actions against peaceful protesters who are exercising their First Amendment rights. Thankfully, governors on that conference call said, no, thank you, Mr. President. Your help is not needed. Those governors, mayors, elected officials are on the front lines. Not all doing the best job, but at least they're out doing something. Now, we saw images of the president hiding in a bunker as he criticized and chastised the leaders who are making some efforts to try to address the systemic racism that we've been focused on for the last week. Again, he's in a bunker at the White House criticizing others, but and I would call it a new low, but we really can't because we've seen this president sink to this place on so many other occasions. Now, in contrast, Vice President Joe Biden likened language used by Trump with regard to protesters to that of Southern racists of the 1960s. And even former President George W. Bush praised peaceful protesters. Now, one thing is crystal clear, and that is Donald Trump is incapable of leading the nation through any crisis, and definitely not a crisis the size and scope of the one confronting our criminal justice system. But where he fails, others are stepping up. My guests today have practical solutions to what has become a seemingly intractable problem. Let's meet them. Our first guest is activist and lobbyist Tiziana Marino. who at the age of 25 has already joined the fight against inequality. Last week, she was in the streets of Washington, D.C., protesting the killing of George Floyd. She believes new legislation is the key to ending police brutality. Welcome, Tyciana Marino. Good morning, Tyciana. How are you?
Good morning. I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm fantastic. Thank you so much for joining us. First, I just want to say to you, congratulations. You are a part of a new breed of activists that we have seen out protesting and demanding change in our criminal justice system. And as a civil rights lawyer, an advocate, and activist, I couldn't be more proud of you for the way that you are lifting your voice on this really important issue. I want to ask you, Tatiana, as you watch the stories on the news, many people see stories that anger them, but you watched the story of George Floyd and you decided to do something very personal. You decided to get involved. Tell us why you decided to take to the streets of DC and to join the protesters.
Yeah, well, I think that involvement is an absolute necessary part of change. You know, Black people for centuries now have faced persecution in this country, have quite literally faced having their lives taken from them over and over in so many ways for so long, for so many centuries, for as long as we've been here. This is the time to step up and to do something. We don't have the option of being silent because our lives literally depend on us demanding justice. So that's why, you know, I can't stand by and not allow myself to do something. I can't stand by and not be engaged. I have cousins and sisters and brothers and aunts and uncles and people that I don't know and still care about and love that are Black people that deserve to live and don't deserve to have their lives taken simply because they're Black. So there is no other option but to stand up and to say something.
Now, I know you've been involved in lobbying, that you've actually worked on some legislation in Washington, D.C. What is the kind of legislation that you think is needed at this moment to address the issues of police brutality that we've seen played out, not just with respect to George Floyd, but we've seen cases of Breonna Taylor, we've seen Ahmaud Arbery. We can go down a long list from Eric Gardner, Oscar Grant. I mean, the list is so long, but it's so important that we recognize and say the names of these African-American men and women who lost their lives to police brutality. And I want to know what you are thinking about the kind of legislation that's needed at this moment.
Yeah, legislation is something that I think directly impacts what our lives look like. It shapes why the world looks the way it does right now. And so it is absolutely imperative that legislation reflect the society that we want to see. Right now, we're seeing a lot of legislation that's being talked about that's sort of at the forefront of addressing some of these issues to actually put stipulations on use of force by officers. So that is something that has to be written in law. As it is now, the legislation around that is far too broad and doesn't really say a whole lot of anything. It doesn't really have any real authority. So in these precincts, officers are able to implement their own policies. So you see some precincts that have very high standards for their officers and some that don't. Policing is, we know historically, something that was by design used to police Black people. So it's gonna take radical reform in order to undo or prevent further harms from being done in the future.
I want to talk a little specifically about some of that legislation, because we heard in Joe Biden's speech that he gave to the nation yesterday, that very eloquent speech where he expressed empathy and compassion, but he also had some very specific legislative solutions to himself. He talked about a bill by Congressman Hakeem Jeffries out of New York. I think that's based on the work that Eric Gardner's daughter, Emerald, who we had on the show Monday, a piece of legislation that she's been pushing Congressman Member Jeffries to carry, and it has to do with eliminating the use of chokeholds. Is that a piece of legislation that you support and you think should move forward?
I would absolutely support that. That piece of legislation is very critical in that, like I said, a lot of this policy around policing is so broad. That piece of legislation directly intends to define what a chokehold is and when it can and cannot be used. That kind of specificity is so critical moving forward in legislation. We have to be clear with the boundaries that police are and are not able to breach.
And the other piece, Tiziana, that the president, or the soon-to-be president, I'm projecting into the future, but former Vice President Biden talked about was national standards, federal standards for policing. And we've heard a lot about that, and that comes up frequently after these high-profile murder cases, after the protests, but nothing has been done. Is that another piece of legislation that you would support, that across the board, all police departments, the 18,000 across this country, would have to follow national standards for policing set up at the federal level?
Absolutely. I think that needs to be enforced. I think that there need to be punitive measures attached to that. If in the event that officers don't follow those protocols, there have to be some accountability moving forward. Like, people are tired of walking out of their homes, or in some cases not even having to leave their homes to be murdered. It's time for work to be done, for meaningful legislation to actually be implemented. And I think that both of those bills, or both of those ideas, policy proposals, are two that would be very strong and that should be broadly supported by all members of Congress.
So, Tiziana, we've seen protesters on the streets now for 8 days, really across the country and across the globe. I mean, the emotions have been high. We've seen, unfortunately, too much focus, I think, in the media on some of the negative, small group of negative people that would tend to honor the memory of Floyd or really lift up the issues of justice. But we've also seen some police who've been willing to listen, to talk to protesters. What has your experience been? And do you think that the police officers that are at these protests are doing enough to listen to protesters like you?
I think that police officers have to do more than just listen for change to happen in the future. As I said before, the system of policing is doing what it was set up to do. So listening and kneeling, and while those are great sentiments, that really does nothing for Black people. Our Blackness still makes us a target. So I think that there has to be more done on the part of police. I think that police officers have to be held more accountable. I don't think that, I recognize that, officers can be good and have good intentions, but when the system itself is designed to do bad to a specific group of people, I don't think that there's really a way that you can nice your way out of that, that you can combat that with good sentiments. There has to be institutional change. There has to be institutional restructuring, systematic wide restructuring and reform.
Well, I want to bring into the conversation someone who I think is committed to the kind of reform that you talked about. And we know there have been a lot of negative images of violence by the police against protesters, but there have been some positive images. There have been images of those police officers listening to, walking, and kneeling with protesters. We've seen some who've actually, put their weapons down and have made every effort possible to engage with protesters. So our next guest is Genesee County Sheriff Chris Swanson. He is one of those officers who has been out on the front line, and his pictures of him talking to protesters have actually gone viral. Welcome, Sheriff Swanson.
Hey, thanks for having me. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you so much for being a part of this show today, because you have some pretty positive images. We've seen a lot of negative images of police using tear gas and rubber bullets and pushing, peaceful protesters back in a very aggressive way. But there's some incredible images of you engaging with protesters. And I just want to ask you, why the difference? Why are we seeing these images of you hugging protesters, putting your weapon down, and taking time to have that kind of dialogue that Tiziana and so many of the protesters want, but others who are using these super aggressive tactics? Why are we seeing these like split screen images?
Well, that's what got us here. And I'm going to be honest. I'm going to speak for Flint, Michigan. I grew up here in this as an adult in police work. I've been here 27 years. I know my people. I know the hearts of the people. I serve the people. And that approach to lay down my sword, so to speak, after I saw a break in the tension that night through fist bumps and an attempt hug, I was like, that's it. The vulnerability turned into be a great strength. And because I know people, because I'm comfortable, it wasn't something I wish I could say I planned it. I wish I could say it's part of the, part of what was in my head, but it was purely instinct. And when I went to the crowd and I saw a pastor there, Jeff Hawkins, who was a street pastor that I'd known for years, and I looked to my right, there was a shot caller there, and I grabbed him and I said, listen, man, I said, I love you. And I said, that guy is not who we are. And I said, these cops love you. And I said, you tell me what we need to do. And he said, talk to the people. And I said, get their attention. And he did. And the second question really is what broke the tension and created a movement around the world of how you can de-escalate and allow the peaceful protesters to have a voice. And that's what happened in Flint, Michigan on May 30.
Wow. Well, I can't commend you enough for relying on those positive instincts and taking advantage, as you said, of that moment where you could get the attention of the protesters. They could hear you and you could hear
That's
them.
right.
I just want to ask you, Sheriff, though, what went through your mind as you saw Derek Chauvin and those other officers involved, ex-officers involved with George Floyd's murder? What went through your mind as you saw them kneeling for almost 9 minutes on his neck and on his back, as bystanders were there, as people were videotaping, almost as if they were sending a brazen message that this is what we're going to do and you can do nothing about it. That was kind of the message that many of us in the media, many African Americans, and just many activists around the country, that's what we saw in that video. Beyond the killing of Mr. Floyd, we saw police saying to us that we're in control and your life as an African American is meaningless to us. You're almost like an animal. So I just want to know what was going through your mind, someone that's been in law enforcement for as long as you've been involved in law enforcement.
But I'm going to tell you, 8 minutes and 46 seconds destroyed, erased years and years of great police relationships with the community in that fast. And I thought, how many more times are we going to see this? The same thing over and over. And what disturbed me the most is what you just said, the cavalier attitude to be on the back of a neck of a human being that's handcuffed, prone on the ground. If the roles were reversed, if an officer walked up and saw another officer prone, handcuffed, and somebody from the community was on the back, a black man was on the back of the neck for 8 minutes, 46 seconds, that would have been a deadly force shooting. So what's the difference? That's what disturbed me the most, is like, how could you even think that's even humanly civil? How is that? How do you think that's part of police work? That's not who we are. That is not who we are. That's what it did. It created a rage into me. I'm not a black man. I'm not a black woman, but I am a white cop, and I love my community, and we live in a very diverse community. And I grew up in a house. My dad was Detroit police. His dad was Detroit police. I was in a neighborhood where 70% black, 30% white. I've been in this jail, which is heavily African American. I'm comfortable with people that don't look like me, act like me. And I would never, ever tolerate somebody treat a human being, let alone anybody else, a human being like that. Like he just killed a buck. It was disgusting.
And so what do you think, and the outrage, across this globe has been appropriate, the rage, the frustration? We can't minimize the importance of those feelings and expressing those feelings, because we can't heal what we don't acknowledge. So it's important to express that the level of outrage that we're all experiencing. But what do you think, Sheriff, are some practical solutions that get us to ending once and for all, not just the conversations we've had after Mike Brown or Eric Gardner or Philando Castile, but how do we end this level of police brutality once and for all?
I'm not going to give you a canned answer that we've heard for years, because I've heard the same things that you've heard, the same lip service, the same, we're going to do better, we're going to do this. Let me tell you this, and to all my police brothers out there, all my police sisters, it starts from the top. It starts from the highest level of police executive to come into their communities and listen to what they say and hold accountable law enforcement. Trust me, I love what I do, but I know wrong is wrong. And I love the code, I love the loyalty, but that doesn't cover wrong. And the way to change it is to take action. People on the street, people in the community are tired of empty words. And so what happened that night in May 30 here in Flint, Michigan, is that act. And again, I'm not a hero. It's not my gig. It was something that I was able to do at the moment that created a movement that now you see peaceful demonstrations the way they're supposed to be, peaceful expressions, peaceful assembly. But if we didn't have that first step, see, the burden falls on us. It falls on us. And when you talk about righteous anger, that's righteous. Righteous anger and righteous protest allows us to make change. And I'm going to tell you, George Floyd changed American policing forever.
Wow, that's powerful. So Sheriff, I have Tatiana Marino on, and I wanted to have her on with you because she's a 25-year-old activist. She's already probably done more in her short time on this earth than most people have ever done in terms of fighting for justice. But sometimes the protesters feel like the police aren't listening. Well, they often aren't listening because they're throwing tear gas at them and rubber bullets. But you're different, and you've demonstrated that you are different. So I wanted Tatiana to have an opportunity to say to you what it is she believes that other officers, particularly those officers that we saw in those gruesome images in DC that were ripping people off the stairs of that church. We wanted her to talk to you and be able to say to you what she thinks police aren't hearing from the protesters. So Tatiana, you have the
I want to hear it.
and the sheriff is listening.
Well, thank you again. I think that while it's such a beautiful sentiment that the sheriff would, put his gun down and join protesters, I know that it doesn't appear to be the sentiment of law enforcement broadly. So I think that, we're going to have to see, as he said, action from the top. For me, that looks like legislative change. There have to be mechanisms to hold officers accountable. And so, that is what I would propose. That is what I stand firm on. I think that, when we're seeing the violence in the street, a lot of people are against the violence that they're seeing from protesters. I think that is a reality that is spawned out of our reality, that is an anger that is based in centuries of oppression.
Yes.
So I call on law enforcement to lay down their weapons, and that I would call on law enforcement broadly to do that, because the reason often that these protests do turn violent is that officers are agitating protesters. People that are there to protest and to have their voice heard are being, having guns pointed in their face. They're having tear gas thrown on them. They're being snatched up and arrested. So I would call on officers to call on Congress to make lasting legislative change.
Is that something, Sheriff? Do you share Tatiana's view that so much of this can be impacted by legislative change that happens at the federal level? And if you do agree with that, what are the new pieces of legislation that you think needs to be passed in this country?
Well, yes, I agree, but I'm probably better to answer the second half of that. You cannot legislate common sense. You can't legislate heart. You can't legislate dignity. That's got to be exampled. And when you use the term activist, the root word of that is active. And that means accountability. People talk about law enforcement being a different standard. Absolutely it is. It's called a higher standard. The burden falls on us. We're law enforcement. We're there to protect and to serve. So a law can come down from the federal level, which I agree. And that would be accountability through maybe limiting the amounts of internals and crimes that are committed during a police officer's crime or their professional career. And that's to be determined. But the immediate change, I don't need legislation to come down and tell me to give people dignity. I want that to come from the heart of the office, the heart of the department, the heart of the chief, the heart of the sergeant, the heart of the rookie, the heart of the 30-year veteran, the heart of the white guy, the black girl that's wearing a uniform. So I'm going to tell you, like right now as we speak, I busted out of an event right now because we've had 4 days in Flint, Michigan, a community that has high crime, that has a high poverty level, has a water crisis we're still dealing with, has a pandemic just like you've been dealing with, and now we have these protests. Let me just tell you, we've had 4 days, protests all 4 days, 0 arrests, 0 fires, and 0 injuries. Our meeting right now is all the cross sections of our community. Black, white, Muslim, Jewish, all these folks are out there. So we can show that solidarity that, listen, we're going to hold ourselves accountable. So I'll do agree that legislation is important, but you got to know your street. You got to know your people. And you got to teach your people to interact with them the right way. Otherwise, we're going to be right back here talking about it.
Well, I'm so glad you said, Sheriff, that you don't need legislation to know that you shouldn't kneel on somebody's neck,
Yeah.
that you shouldn't kneel on somebody's back, that you shouldn't shoot someone who is unarmed and involved in a nonviolent crime. So
That's right.
some of this is common sense, and some of this can be enacted today. And I
That's
think
right.
that's what's so frustrating is that we have these conversations after these high-profile shootings,
Yeah.
and there's this laundry list of things to implement. But I would challenge you, Sheriff, to challenge your other law enforcement colleagues to start today implementing those common sense measures that you just identified, that you don't need a law enforcement
That's right.
manual. You don't have to rewrite a manual. You don't need Congress to convene. You don't need any of that.
That's
you don't
right.
need to go back and tell people, cut it out.
That's right.
Don't abuse people.
Right now.
Black people are human. We are human beings and we deserve to be treated like anyone else in this society. Don't roll up 4 deep on a man and the call comes over that it might be a counterfeit $20 bill. Because you're not going to roll up that way in a high income, wealthy white community with a white person. So some of these things we know can be changed, and they can be changed now. And I just want to thank you, Sheriff, for highlighting that. I want to thank you for being the example, because sometimes people just need to see people that look like them do the right thing. So
That's right.
fellow law enforcement agents will see you look like them, and they see you doing the right thing, and they will start to do the right thing. I want to thank you so much, Sheriff, for taking time out of your busy schedule. Thank you, Tyciana Marino, for your advocacy. You are a group of young activists and protesters that we're going to be looking to lead this nation to the place of justice where we want to all be.
Right.
We need your voice, so stay strong and stay safe out there as you continue to lift up, the voice of justice. Thanks to both of you for joining me this morning.
Thank you.
All right. Yeah, we heard it from the sheriff. You don't need legislation. Legislation is great, but some of the stuff can just be done right now. So my next guest, I think he agrees with me. I think there's a lot of things that he would say can be done right now, and it's not just with African Americans. Award-winning author, activist, and nationally recognized anti-racism educator, Paul Cavell. He's also the author of Uprooting Racism: How White People Can Work for Racial Justice. Paul says white people need to do more to break the silence on racism. Good morning, Paul. Good morning, Paul.
Good morning. It's good to be with you and be part of the conversation.
Thank you so much for lending your voice on this. It takes a lot of courage sometimes to say those things that might make people uncomfortable. But I want to ask you first, Paul, what did you think when you saw Derek Chauvin kneeling, pressing his knee into the neck of George Floyd, and those other 3 officers standing around cavalierly, hands in their pockets, not responding to the pleas from the bystanders to stop, not responding to George's call that he couldn't breathe, calling on his mother as he was breathing his last breath? What did you feel in that moment when you saw that?
It was definitely heartbreaking. I felt incredibly sad and angry and frustrated. And there was also a sense of, here we go again. Every year there's major visible, I grew up, I remember Rodney King, that was
1992 Los Angeles, yes.
40 years ago. And we watched that happen over and over again on TV. The problem is not our immediate reaction. Our problem is putting all of our reactions together and saying, okay, we need to show up. We need to address this. And white people have a crucial role because it's silence in white communities that allows racism to go unacknowledged and unaddressed.
I want to ask you, Paul, thank you for calling that out and calling out the silence that is often so prevalent in these cases. So is it fair to assume that you believe that so many of these cases of police brutality are the result of racism?
Absolutely. I mean, we have to look at the larger picture. First of all, our country was founded on the labor of enslaved Africans and the stealing of land from Native Americans and genocide. The police were set up to enforce white property, ruling class protect their property. But we also have to look at today at what's happening. Our political leaders are using racism to scapegoat communities of color, African Americans, immigrants, etc., to turn people's attention away from the concentration of wealth in our society. We have a pandemic in which people of color are losing their lives 2 or 3 times as often as white people because of racism in the healthcare system, in our communities, and the pollution, environmental degradation, and poor and low-income communities. So racism is the big picture. It is the framework we need to look at to understand these individual acts.
So Paul, as a white guy, you say that, and you seem to say it with complete ease and comfort. And in fact, in your book, you quoted a poll that says that only 31% of white people believe racism is a major societal problem. Is that statistic still accurate? Is it still the case that only 31% of white people believe that racism is an issue in this country?
Well, what happens is most white people think that there is racism, but it's in egregious acts like this one, or it's rogue cops, or it's exceptional. It's not the norm. It's not the everyday experience of people of color. So white people mostly don't deny that there's racism. They just limit it to such an extent that they don't see the big picture, and therefore they don't feel like compelled to get involved in any kind of serious way.
And when you say the big picture, Paul, are you referring to institutional racism, those microaggressions that we see played out, like the one we saw in Central Park involving that Harvard-educated bird watcher? Are you talking about issues of white privilege? These are really uncomfortable for many people conversations, Paul, and I feel like we get close after these major shootings, after the protests, we get really close to having these really difficult conversations, and then we pull back because it does get uncomfortable for that well-intentioned white person who says, I'm not a racist. I marched with Dr. Martin Luther King. I was at in Ferguson during the protest after Mike Brown. I have Black friends. I live in a mixed community, and they start enumerating these things that they think, point to the fact that they're not racist. And then we never get really much further in the conversation. How do we break through, Paul? How do we stop getting right to that point where we pull back?
I think that part of it is the conversations we need to have, the breaking the silence in our communities, that we have to be able to talk with our friends, our family, our children, our neighbors, our coworkers about racism. We have to identify it and talk about our feelings, and we have to understand the patterns of it. And I think that what you're saying is absolutely true. We lean towards, in moments like this, we lean towards doing something, and then we come back and we pull back because, well, somebody else will take care of it, or it's not my problem, or it's just rogue cops and over there in Minneapolis, and I live over here in Oregon, or what, we do all kinds of things to excuse ourselves. One important piece of that is, as white people, we need to understand that our lives are intimately impacted by racism every day. It's not over there, it's not somebody else. If I look at who makes my clothes, if I think about who grows the food that I eat, if I think about who made the computer and cell phones that I use, every day my life is interdependent with the lives of people of color working in this country and around the world to provide me with certain benefits. And I need to understand that pollution in other communities drifts into my rivers, my air, my water, that there's no way that I am not separate from the lives of people of color around me. And on top of that, we have to realize that our moral integrity is incredibly compromised if we're not standing up for justice and we're actually benefiting from the exploitation of other people. So there's tremendous costs that as white people, we need to realize we pay for white supremacy and this is about mutual interest. It's not about showing up for somebody else. It's about understanding that we're in this together.
And you talk about that in your book, Paul. You provide actual tools for how white people can, as you call, work as allies for racial justice. Give us a couple of those tools that can be implemented again today. We're talking solutions today, and I found it interesting that you've actually outlined in your book some tools. What are a couple of those tools that can be used?
Well, one of the tools is to think about what you can do in the networks that you're already involved with. As white people, we are connected. We have all kinds of social capital. We're connected to political leaders. We're connected to school teachers. We're connected to clergy. We're connected to all kinds of people. And we need to be raising these issues. We need to be talking to people. And we also need to be thinking about, okay, so what am I going to do? How do I join up with people in my community that are already involved in doing racial justice work? And that's usually led by people of color. We have a national organization called SURGE, Showing Up for Racial Justice. And it's an organization dedicated to mobilizing and educating white people about working for racial justice and doing direct solidarity work with people of color in grassroots community groups. So one thing that people can do is go on the website, find a chapter near you, join one of the campaigns, and actually do something. As white people, we often think that if we talk about it or we understand it, then we're doing something, but that's not activism. Get together with a handful of friends and we'll make some signs and go down in front of the police station. Get out there and go to a city hall, city council meeting, and talk about affordable housing, talk about medical care. A big part of the policing problem is that over half of the budgets of most of our communities now go to policing. And that means that we need to shift that money into healthcare, into education, into affordable housing. So there's tremendous amount of work that we can be doing, but it means stepping up, getting together with other people, looking to people of color for leadership, and then making something happen.
Well, we got to leave it right there, Paul, but thank you. I love your words. I wrote them down. You said do something. Stop talking about it and do something about it. And a very powerful message at a really critical time in our history as we reflect on how we move forward and how do we make the promise of justice more than just, empty slogans and platitudes. So thank you, Paul, for the work that you're doing around this issue and for lifting your voice at such an important time. All right, we heard Paul telling white people to do something. Next, in our last two segments, we've been talking a lot about solutions. So one thing that happened in December of 2014 in response to the unrest in Ferguson, Missouri that followed the fatal shooting of Mike Brown, then President Barack Obama created the President's Task Force on 21st Century Policing. And this group was dedicated to improving policing of minority communities. My next guests were members of this important task force, and they created key recommendations that many say, if they had been adopted, we wouldn't have nearly as many shootings of Black men as we have today. And I'm asking the question today, can these recommendations be the key to ending the police brutality that we've witnessed over decades in this country? So welcome this morning, Sean Michael Smoot. He's an author. He's the director and chief counsel of the Police Benevolent and Protective Association of Illinois. And welcome back to the show, nationally recognized law enforcement expert, former chief of police of the Rochester Police Department, Dr. Cedric Alexander. Cedric, as I think gives me permission to call him because we're colleagues and now friends. Cedric literally helped to write the book on modern community policing. Thank you so much, Cedric, for joining me again. You were here with us Monday. I'm always so glad to talk with you because you're such a wealth of knowledge. And welcome to you, Sean. Both of you served together on this 21st Century Commission on Policing. So I want to ask you, Sean, for those in the audience that don't know, what is this commission and what was this purpose?
Well, it was, first of all, thank you very much for having me on. It's a real honor to also share this time with Cedric Alexander, my colleague and friend. who served on the task force alongside me. This task force came out of a series of very tragic events that occurred leading up to and including the killing of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri. Sadly, there were events that occurred after Mr. Brown's death as well. President Obama brought together a very distinguished group of folks. I won't say that about myself necessarily, but I was honored to share a spot on the task force with Brian Stevenson and Cedric Alexander, Charles Ramsey, Lori Robinson, and Brittany Packnett, who came literally almost off the streets in Ferguson and did a lot of protest work down there, and Roberto Villaseñor and all of the others who served. And he gave us a very clear mandate and a very short time frame to work within. Our mandate was to come back with real, concrete, and practical recommendations to build trust and legitimacy between police and the communities that they serve, and also to do these things and improve community policing, while also continuing to keep in mind the idea that crime at that time had been at an all-time low, particularly violent crimes. And so we met several times all over the United States. We had listening sessions. Our deliberations were all done publicly, and our work was all done publicly, so people could watch online on C-SPAN, attend, provide testimony, submit written testimony, literally thousands of pages of which were submitted and which we went through. And we generated this document called the Final Report of the President's Task Force on 21st Century Policing. And inside this document are about 60 very solid, practical, evidence-based recommendations for doing a myriad of things. And we started with trust and legitimacy. And I think it's important to note we as the other bookend to the pillars that are included in this report, we also dealt with officer safety and wellness, so which is a very important piece of the puzzle as well.
So Cedric, I want to ask you, this morning we've talked to a protester, we've talked to a sheriff on the front line, and we talked to a white guy who says, he is a social justice educator. And from those guests, here's the list that I made of solution. More federal legislation. That's what our protester said. We heard the sheriff say some of this is just common sense. Just don't engage in certain behavior that is wrong and is quite frankly stupid. And then we heard Paul say to white people, stop talking and do something. What are and those are some, I think, solutions that all of us can agree to, but I want to ask you, what are some of the top 3 recommendations, or what were the top 3 recommendations coming out of that 21st Century Commission process that you and Sean engaged in?
Well, first of all, let me say thank you for having me again. And it's great to see my friend Sean Smoot. Don't get to see him very often. But the 6 pillars, I'm going to read each one of them to you so we can talk about any of them you like. Building trust and legitimacy, policy and oversight, technology and social media, community policing and crime reduction, training and education, and of course, lastly, as Sean mentioned, the other bookend to that was officer wellness. So let me say this. I've chiefed 2 police departments in this country. And one thing that I am very clear about, that there needs to be reform within the culture of policing. And I think this country now has come to another tipping point, Ariva, but we're in a very different kind of place now, because we're seeing the longevity of these protests. We're seeing the intensity of this protest, not just in this country, but they're spreading around the world. So this is a movement. This is just not a moment in time that maybe folks hope will go away and things will return to normal. Nothing is going to return to normal, I think, as we knew them. COVID is one of those, and this come on top of that. And people are tense, people are fed up, people are tired. But to your question, in your prior guest that I had an opportunity to listen to some of it, it's very clearly this, when it comes to municipal policing in this country, it is to serve. That's the primary function, to serve people, not for the community to serve you, but for you to serve the community. That's the reason why you were trained, you were recruited, so forth and so on. But if it was three things that I've noted over the years, for me, I think that we really got to go back and take a look at. We got to look at who we recruit into the profession. And I truly believe it has to be people that have a moral compass and have a sense of compassion and have humanity towards other people other than themselves. I think those are basic fundamental qualities that I or Sean cannot teach you in a police academy. You either have that growing up somewhere in your life or you don't have it. Because what we saw demonstrated on May 25th was just that. Three individuals who lacked a moral character, quite frankly, and a moral compass, and the ability to have compassion as a man breathe and beg for his life right in front of all of us. So that's the first thing that you have to have. I need to know more than just his credit record, his driving record, or her criminal record, whatever. I need that, but I also need to know something about their character, who they are, what's their moral turpitude, what's their compass. And then we bring them into an academy, which I think across the country, we really do a pretty good job at training. They have 4 or 5, 6 months of police officer training. There's emphasis on use of force. There's emphasis on car stops. There's emphasis on state laws and regulations and so forth and so on. But we also have to make sure that we emphasize community building, because that's 80% really of what you do. It really is building those relationships. And then we need a way to evaluate how well our officers are integrating into the community. We have a way to measure how many traffic tickets they write, how many arrests they made, and that kind of thing. But we are moving more away from that, more into building those relationships. Because for me to be effective as a police officer, people have to see me as being legitimate. And being legitimate means that they are able to trust me. So we have to train them. And then once they're trained and we assign them to precincts or station houses, or whatever the case may happen to be, they have to have good supervision. Supervision that role models for them what the expectation is inside that culture. Minneapolis, if you look at the behavior of those four ex-officers on that street, something tells me or suggests to me that something inherently is in question inside that larger system. Because how can they sustain themselves on that job if they have no moral compass, if they have no compassion? You follow what I'm saying? And they have no humanity. So what is it about that larger system inside that clearly may be dysfunctional itself?
And I want to ask you about that, Cedric. Can I stop you for a moment and just ask you? We know that Chauvin had at least 18 complaints filed against him,
right,
and that this department had just a pattern of of treatment of African Americans that was disparate
Right.
from how it treated white citizens.
Right.
How is it though that Chauvin could still be on the streets after 18 complaints? And I bring that up because what we've been hearing from a lot of protesters is the police union. That the police union is a part of the problem, that the police union prevented that Black sheriff in Minneapolis, who's just been on the job for 3 years, who was a reformer, that the union, opposed him at every point, and that unions around the country, police unions, unlike nurses unions or teachers unions, have too much power and prevent bad cops from being taken off the streets. Would you agree with that?
Well, it's yes and no. And let me explain why. I had the opportunity to, in Rochester, New York, which is a very unionized police department, and in DeKalb County, Georgia, where there was no union. It's more of a right to work state. And they had a lot of protections in the state of New York. And certainly Sean can speak more about their role and what their responsibilities are in the protection of their officers. But for me, here's what I found, Ariva. It is regardless of what agreements that had been made between management and union in terms of what I was able to do or not to do, always reminded of this. Police officers don't come on the job to join the union. They come on the job to be police officers. They have a union there to protect them, to make sure they have good pay, good benefits, decent working environment, etc. However, it is my attitude, my behavior that sets the tone, and utilize whatever disciplinary processes that we have in place and challenge unions or anybody else if we feel that we need to expel an officer. So the point of it is this: we have a lot of well-intended chiefs and sheriffs across this country, but oftentimes, and clearly right now, at this very moment, we also have to step back and look inside of our organizations and see what it is that we can help build a different culture. What is my expectation as a chief, whether you're a union member or not? Because I set that tone, myself, my deputy chiefs, right on down to the last person hired. So it becomes incumbent upon me to provide an atmosphere that doesn't tolerate the behaviors that we see oftentimes demonstrated. Minneapolis has had a long history of issues. So has Philadelphia. So has LA. So have Chicago. So have tons of departments across this country. We hear about them. We know about them. And some of them are being rectified. They're chiefs that are in there working hard, trying to change the culture. But yes, it has its challenges. But there's going to have to probably be some outside reform to influence some of this change, because I think there's some things chiefs and sheriffs can do on their own, and then there's some things that are much more challenging.
Well, speaking of outside influences, I want to ask you this, Sean. Right now in Los Angeles, not too far from where I live, there have been thousands of protesters protesting against this proposed $200 million increase to the Los Angeles Police Department's budget for bonuses for police officers. Thousands of people protested in front of the mayor's office, and they're really calling for the police department to be defunded. And we're hearing that again more and more from activists. And we heard Paul Cabal say that take some of that funding from police departments, put it into mental health, put it into housing, put it into other community-based programs. Do you think one solution is to reduce substantially the budgets of police and to give some of those responsibilities to other human service departments in counties and cities?
I mean, I can see where somebody would make that assumption, but history tells us a different story. And what I mean by that is, if name any, the list of things that you just mentioned: mental health services, education, those types of things are frankly things that police have been tasked with now. We ask our police officers to be mental health treatment providers at times. We ask them to be medical care providers at times. We ask them to fight crime, investigate crime. We ask them, so we tell them we want them to fight crime, which is a problem in one sense, because this whole idea of fighting crime kind of goes back to the warrior mentality rather than the guardian mentality that we want them to have. And you know, we just keep putting more and more onto police officers. In some cities, they're expected to enforce building codes and vandalism issues and stuff like that. And the fact of the matter is, you know, I think police would be very willing to give up some of those responsibilities. Mm-hmm. and would be willing to even carve off a piece of the police department's budget to give it to mental health services department. But when it comes time to do that, elected officials don't seem to want to do it. And my observation over the last 25 years is that in many places, under the rubric of community policing, cities and counties and states have put on additional responsibilities to police officers that really the police shouldn't be doing. You know, the problem, the overriding problem here is that when you call 911, it's the only government phone number that everybody knows and that's answered 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And if there were a 911 number for somebody who's living with a person that's suffering from mental illness or near someone who's suffering from mental illness that needs help, you could call that number and mental health professionals would come and an ambulance would come and take that person and get them the care that they need. What happens today, almost universally, is you call 911 and who gets sent? A police officer.
Well,
And-
I'm
and
sorry,
that's a problem.
I'm running out of time, Sean. I'm going to have to leave it there, but I think what I'm hearing from both of you is that there was some important work done by that commission and some
Yep.
incredible recommendations that were made. And hopefully, if not in this administration, not much hope there, but hopefully in the next administration, a lot of those proposals, recommendations will be put into action. And some of those common sense things that can happen now, as Cedric said, the sheriffs and police chiefs themselves can start to do by modeling the behavior that they want their officers to engage in. That
Right.
can happen today. We don't need legislation. We don't need a big, thick
Right.
report. We don't need to meet for these sheriffs and police officers to step up and to lead and to demonstrate leadership to officers on the street. Thank you so much, both of you, for your leadership,
you.
for your voice. I know, Cedric, you're going to be a part of a very important town hall tonight, a virtual town hall with NAACP, with my senator, Senator Kamala Harris, and some other members of the civil rights community and law enforcement community talking about these issues. So this is an ongoing conversation. We're having it all over the country because people are sick and tired of being sick and tired. So thank you guys for your voice and
Thank
thank you
you.
for your work on this really important issue.
All right.
Thank you, ma'am.
Yeah, we're talking about it because everybody is talking about how do we move to a different place in this society. You know, and Socrates said, the secret of change is to focus all of your energy not on fighting the old, but on building the new. The hundreds of thousands of protesters and activists that have taken to the streets to protest George Floyd's life have made it clear that the old way of policing African American men and women can and will never, ever be acceptable again. This cadre of protesters want a new and better system, one that honors the dignity and humanity of all people. And see, we can get there, and we can get there by continuing to fight for justice, demanding more from our elected officials, paying more attention to local district attorney and mayoral races, listening and implementing the smart policy changes recommended by law enforcement experts like Cedric Alexander and Sean Michael Smoot. And we can get there by listening to the voices of a new generation of activists. See, we've got to do the uncomfortable work of calling out the silence of those that pretend to be allies, but who are in power positions and positions of privilege and authority. And we can get there, but we must move beyond empty and broken promises, catchy tweets, empty expressions of solidarity, and Instagram challenges. Y'all know change is hard, but it's not impossible. Changing the hearts and minds of racist cops is hard, but weeding them out and holding them accountable is possible. Creating a just and equitable criminal justice system will be hard, but not impossible. We can get there by concrete action that starts today, not tomorrow, not next week, not in the next election, not in 2021, but today. So I just want to thank all of my guests who joined me this morning on this really important conversation we're having. Visit the Special Report Facebook page for more information on today's show and follow me at Areva Martin and at Special Needs Network. Thanks to our sponsor, to our production team, and join me on Friday because we're talking about folks who are doing extraordinary things during the protests. Because all the stuff that you see on TV that makes it look like the protests are bad, that ain't true. There are a lot of folks out there showing they're better angels, and we want you to meet them. Y'all be safe out there, and remember, we are stronger together.